The pain you fear today may be the path God is using to save your tomorrow.
There is a question that has echoed through the corridors of human history since the first tear ever fell to the ground. Why does God allow suffering? If God is good, why do the innocent cry in the night? Why do prayers sometimes seem to vanish into the silence of the heavens? Why does pain visit the homes of the faithful just as often as it visits those who have never bowed their heads in prayer? For centuries, kings, prophets, philosophers, and ordinary people have wrestled with this mystery. Some have lost their faith trying to answer it. Others have found their faith forged in the very fires of suffering itself. But hidden within one of the most powerful passages ever written lies a sentence that dares to confront this question directly. A sentence written nearly 2,000 years ago by a man who understood suffering more than most. A man who had been beaten, imprisoned, rejected, and hunted for his faith. His name was Paul, and in his letter to the Romans, he wrote words that have comforted millions across centuries. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. At first glance, the statement sounds almost impossible. All things? Even tragedy? Even betrayal? Even the kind of pain that leaves scars no one else can see? To understand what Paul meant, we must travel back nearly 2,000 years, back to the Roman Empire, back to a time when following Christ could cost you everything. The city of Rome, in the first century, was the beating heart of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Marble temples towered above crowded streets. Soldiers marched through the forums in gleaming armor. Merchants shouted in markets filled with spices, silks, and rumors from the edges of the known world. But beneath the surface of this magnificent city lived a small and fragile community. Followers of a crucified carpenter from Judea, Christians. They had no buildings, no political power, no protection. They gathered quietly in homes and hidden rooms, whispering prayers and reading letters passed between churches scattered across the empire. And many of them were afraid, because the world around them was growing hostile. Families rejected them. Neighbors mocked them. Authorities watched them with suspicion. Some believers had already lost their homes, their livelihoods, even their lives. To them, faith was not a comfortable tradition. It was a daily risk. It was into this tense and uncertain world that Paul's letter arrived. Paul himself had never even visited Rome when he wrote it, but he knew suffering. Few people in history had endured what he had. Once a respected Pharisee, Paul had been a man of influence and power. He had studied under the greatest teachers of Jewish law. But after encountering Jesus in a moment that shattered everything he thought he knew, his life changed forever. The man who once persecuted Christians became one of their greatest leaders, and the cost was enormous. Paul was beaten with rods, whipped, stoned, and left for dead, imprisoned multiple times. He traveled thousands of miles on dangerous roads and violent seas, preaching a message many wanted to silence. He knew hunger. He knew loneliness. He knew betrayal. Yet through all of it, his faith did not collapse. In fact, it grew stronger. Which raises an extraordinary question. How could a man who suffered so much write words like, "All things work together for good"? What did he see that others could not? To answer that question, we need to understand something crucial about the world Paul lived in. Because suffering was not rare in the ancient world. It was constant. Disease could sweep through a city overnight. War could destroy entire regions. Children often did not live to adulthood. Pain was woven deeply into everyday life, and many ancient philosophies tried to explain it. Some believed suffering was punishment from the gods. Others believed life itself was meaningless chaos. Still, others taught that the best solution was emotional detachment, simply learning not to care. But Christianity offered a radically different perspective. Instead of denying suffering, it stepped directly into it. At the center of the Christian story was not a distant God watching human pain from afar. It was a God who entered the world and suffered himself, Jesus, the Son of God who walked dusty roads, touched the sick, wept with the grieving, and ultimately died one of the most brutal deaths imaginable on a Roman cross. To the early Christians, this changed everything. Because if God himself had suffered, then suffering could no longer be dismissed as meaningless. But that still left a haunting mystery. If God is powerful enough to stop suffering, why doesn't he? Why allow pain at all? This is where Paul's words in Romans begin to reveal something deeper. When he wrote that God works in all things for good, he did not say that all things are good. That distinction matters, because pain itself is not good. Loss is not good. Evil is not good. Christianity has never claimed otherwise. But Paul was pointing towards something far more mysterious, something hidden beneath the surface of history, a divine work unfolding in ways humans often cannot see. Imagine watching a master artist paint a massive mural. If you focus on a single brushstroke, it may look chaotic, even ugly. Dark colors, sharp lines, strange shapes that make no sense. But when you step back and see the entire painting, the chaos suddenly forms a masterpiece. Paul believed history works something like that. What humans see are the individual brushstrokes, moments of pain, moments of confusion, moments when everything seems broken beyond repair. But God sees the entire canvas, and according to Paul, he is weaving even the darkest threads into a story that ultimately leads to redemption. This belief was not abstract philosophy for the early Christians. It was survival, because the storms were only beginning. Within a few years of Paul writing his letter, the Roman Empire would erupt into one of the most brutal persecutions Christians had ever faced. It began with fire. In the year 64 AD, a massive blaze tore through the city of Rome. Flames devoured neighborhoods for days. Thousands lost their homes. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the emperor himself, Nero, had ordered the fire to clear land for his grand building projects. Facing public outrage, Nero needed someone to blame, and he found a convenient target: Christians. They were already misunderstood, already viewed as strange and dangerous. Soon accusations spread across the city. Christians were arrested, interrogated, condemned. Ancient historians record horrifying scenes. Believers thrown to wild animals in public arenas. Others crucified along roads. Some even burned alive to serve as human torches in the emperor's gardens. It was one of the darkest chapters in early Christian history. And yet, something astonishing happened. The movement did not disappear. It grew. Despite fear, despite suffering, despite death, the faith continued to spread across the empire. Why? Because the believers held tightly to the conviction Paul had written in his letter, that somehow, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, God was still working. There are stories preserved in early Christian writings that reveal the depth of this faith. One account tells of believers singing hymns while facing execution. Another describes prisoners encouraging each other in Roman cells the night before their deaths. To the outside world, it seemed irrational, but to them, suffering had taken on a different meaning. Not meaningless pain, but a chapter in a larger story, a story they believed God was still writing. And yet, even with such faith, the question remained. Because suffering did not only strike in grand historical moments, it struck quietly, in ordinary lives. A mother losing a child, a man watching his health slowly fade, a family torn apart by betrayal. Moments when no explanation seems sufficient, moments when faith feels fragile, moments when Romans 8:28 can feel almost impossible to believe. Even Paul himself wrestled with suffering in deeply personal ways. In another letter, he speaks about something he calls a thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what it was. Some believe it was a physical illness. Others think it may have been persecution or emotional torment. Whatever it was, it hurt deeply, and Paul prayed for it to be taken away. 3 times he begged God to remove it, but the answer he received was not what he expected. God did not remove the suffering. Instead, Paul heard words that would reshape how millions understand pain. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. In other words, the struggle itself was not meaningless. It became the place where something greater could emerge. Strength, faith, dependence on God. But this still leaves one final and unsettling question. If God can bring good out of suffering, why does the suffering sometimes feel so unbearable? Why does the night sometimes feel so long? Why does it sometimes seem like God is silent while we are hurting? For the early Christians, the answer was not found in simple explanations. It was found in a promise that appears just a few verses after Romans 8:28. A promise that reveals the ultimate destination of the story God is writing. But to understand that promise, we must look deeper into the rest of Paul's words, because hidden in the same chapter is a vision of the future so powerful, so breathtaking, that it changes how suffering itself is understood. A vision that suggests the pain of this world is not the end of the story, not even close. But to see it, we must continue the journey. Paul began in his letter, and what he reveals next may change the way you see suffering forever. The promise Paul was pointing toward does not begin with comfort. It begins with a strange and unsettling image, an image of a world that is groaning. Just a few lines after the words, "All things work together for good," Paul writes something remarkable. He says that all creation itself is waiting with eager expectation, waiting for something that has not yet happened. And he describes creation as if it were alive, breathing, straining, almost like a mother in labor, groaning. Not because everything is fine, but because something new is about to be born. To understand why Paul uses this image, we have to step back and look at the larger story the Bible tells about the world. Because according to Scripture, the world we see today is not the world as it was originally meant to be. The first pages of the Bible describe a creation that was whole, harmony between humanity and God, harmony between humanity and the earth. No death, no decay, no suffering. But something broke. Humanity chose independence from God. Not just a single mistake, but a turning of the human heart away from the Creator. And according to the biblical story, that fracture did not remain confined to the human soul. It spread outward, into relationships, into societies, into nature itself. The world became a place where beauty and tragedy exist side by side, where love exists, but so does loss, where life flourishes, but death follows closely behind. Paul believed the entire creation now lives in that tension, a beautiful world, but a wounded one. And that explains something many people instinctively feel when they experience suffering, the sense that things are not supposed to be this way. When a child dies, we feel outrage. When injustice happens, we feel anger. When illness steals years from someone's life, something inside us whispers that the world is not working the way it should. According to Paul, that instinct is not wrong. It is a clue, a signal that the world is still waiting for restoration. But Paul takes the idea even further. He writes that creation is not groaning in despair. It is groaning in hope, like labor pains before birth. Painful, yes, but leading somewhere. And then Paul turns the lens toward human life itself. He says that believers also groan, even those who have faith, even those who trust God. Faith does not eliminate suffering. It does not shield people from grief. Christians still cry, still struggle, still face seasons where the future feels uncertain. But according to Paul, their suffering carries a different weight because it is connected to a promise. He writes that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. That statement is almost shocking when you remember who wrote it. This was the same man who had been beaten, the same man who had spent nights in prison, the same man who knew that his mission would likely end in execution. Yet he believed something about the future so deeply that it transformed how he viewed the present. Paul believed history was moving toward restoration, not endless cycles of pain, not meaningless chaos, but renewal. A future where the brokenness of the world would finally be healed, where death itself would be defeated, where every tear would be wiped away. For Paul, the suffering of this world was real, but it was temporary, like a long night before sunrise. And this belief began to spread through the early Christian communities. It changed the way people faced persecution. It changed how they endured hardship, because suffering was no longer the final chapter. But there is something even more profound hidden in Romans chapter 8. Paul does not say that God only works after suffering. He says God works through it. That idea is difficult because it suggests that even the darkest chapters of life can become part of a larger purpose. History provides powerful examples of this. Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, years of betrayal, years of imprisonment, years of forgotten promises. And yet, decades later, Joseph stood face to face with the very brothers who had destroyed his life. And he said something extraordinary. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Joseph did not deny the pain. He did not pretend the betrayal was good, but he recognized something that could only be seen with time. God had been working behind the scenes the entire time, turning what others meant for evil into a path that saved countless lives. The same pattern appears again and again in Scripture. David hunted through the wilderness before becoming king. Job losing everything before witnessing God's restoration. And ultimately, Jesus himself. The crucifixion looked like defeat. It looked like injustice winning. It looked like hope being buried in a tomb. But Christians believe that the darkest moment in human history became the doorway to redemption. The cross, the ultimate symbol of suffering, became the symbol of salvation. Which leads back to the heart of Paul's message. God does not promise a life without suffering, but he promises that suffering will never be wasted, even when we cannot see how, even when the reasons remain hidden for years, or even a lifetime. Paul's statement in Romans 8:28 is not naive optimism. It is not pretending everything will feel good. It is a declaration of trust in a God who is still writing the story. A God who can take broken pieces and weave them into something greater than we imagined. Sometimes we see glimpses of that purpose in this life. A person who survives tragedy and later helps others heal. A painful season that shapes compassion or wisdom. A loss that redirects someone toward a path they never expected but desperately needed. But other times, the meaning remains hidden. And this is where faith becomes something deeper than understanding. Because trusting God does not mean we have every answer. It means we believe the author of the story sees more than we do. There is a scene in ancient Roman arenas that historians often describe when talking about early Christians. Crowds would gather to watch prisoners face wild animals. To the spectators, it was entertainment. But sometimes something unexpected would happen. Instead of screaming in terror, the condemned believers would begin singing, quietly at first, then louder, hymns of hope, songs about resurrection, songs about a kingdom greater than Rome. The crowd did not understand it. How could people facing death sing? But those believers believed that death was not the end of the story. They believed that the same God who raised Jesus from the dead would one day restore all things. And that belief gave them a strength the empire could not crush. Paul ends Romans chapter 8 with words that have echoed across centuries. Words that may be some of the most powerful ever written. He asks a series of questions. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, or hardship, or persecution, or famine, or danger or sword? And then he answers, "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, will be able to separate us from the love of God." That is the final answer Paul offers to the mystery of suffering. Not a simple explanation, but a promise. A promise that pain will not have the final word. A promise that even in the darkest valleys, God has not abandoned his people. And a promise that one day the story will reach a conclusion more beautiful than anything we can imagine. Because the same God who began the story of creation is also the one who will finish it. Until then, humanity lives in the middle chapters, the chapters where questions still exist, where faith is sometimes tested, where suffering is real, but also where hope refuses to die. And maybe that is why the words of Romans 8:28 have survived for nearly 2,000 years, because they remind us of something we desperately need to hear. That even when life feels chaotic, even when the pieces seem broken, even when we cannot see the full picture, God is still working, quietly, patiently, faithfully, turning even the darkest moments into threads in a much larger masterpiece. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: the story is not finished yet. If this message helped you see suffering from a new perspective, take a moment right now to support the channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the mysteries of the Bible. Leave a like so this message can reach more people who might need hope today. And in the comments, share your thoughts or your own experiences with faith during difficult moments. Your story might encourage someone else who is going through a dark season right now. And if you want to continue exploring the most fascinating and mysterious stories hidden in the scriptures, make sure to watch the next video on this channel, because some of the most powerful revelations in the Bible are still waiting to be discovered.